The news following the NFL trade deadline and the Minnesota Vikings is that number one, Jesus Christ is still king, and number two, Donald J. Trump is the 47th President of the United States of America. America. He wiped out Kamala Harris. Not even a close competition at all. And I think the Kamala Harris campaign is speechless. Speechless. And we're going to talk about the Minnesota Vikings. But number one, Jesus is king. Number two, Trump is president. So, big day yesterday. All right, as for the Minnesota Vikings, they stood pat on Tuesday as trade deadline came and trade deadline passed. And the big story following the trade deadline is that there were a number of trades throughout the NFL. Not huge paces. Mike Williams from the Jets to the Steelers was a decent trade. There's some other smaller bit trades, but not any huge players like Dexter Lawrence or any other guys moving from a team to a team that made that big of a difference. But the Minnesota Vikings stood pat. They did not make any additional moves. But here's the real story, because the headlines are showing that the Vikings stood pat, didn't make any moves. They didn't trade for a cornerback that they might have been interested in. They didn't add any defensive tackle help on the defensive line that they could have been interested in. Dexter Lawrence, J.C. Horn, these are some of the names that were swirling around the rumor mill as for the Minnesota Vikings. But even though that they didn't make a trade on trade deadline day, they didn't stand pat at the trade deadline. They made a move when they needed to make a move, and they made a move earlier than most teams did. When Christian Darrisaw went down, the Minnesota Vikings had a decision to make, and they had to decide if they were going to trade and sign a left tackle or move Blake Brandel to left tackle, put Dalton Reisner in at left guard, and just pray that Ed Ingram figures it out at right guard. But no, they didn't do that. They didn't stand pat and just let this season play out, call it a lost year because you lost your best offensive lineman. They made a trade for a guy that the Jacksonville Jaguars haven't signed, is on a 1-year deal, and they can rent him. And he just got benched by the Jacksonville Jaguars. Not that that's a good sign for the Vikings to trade for him, but he was a starting caliber left tackle earlier in the season, and his statistics are better than what would have been if they didn't trade for him. And game number one came, and game number one passed. He started left tackle and did a pretty good job. 0 sacks allowed, a couple of hurries were allowed by him. But all in all, in just a few days, brought him in on Wednesday, practices for a few days, starts Sunday Night Football against a Colts defensive line that's pretty solid, and he performed pretty well. I don't think you could have asked him to perform any better than what he did. So even though the story is that the Vikings didn't make any additional moves or any moves on trade deadline day, the Minnesota Vikings made a massive move on the week before the trade deadline because they kept their roster stable. If they didn't make that move, you could argue that the Minnesota Vikings are calling it a lost season. And you know what? If you just make the playoffs, good for them. We're really pointing our eyes and building for the 2025 NFL season. But they proved that they didn't do that. They feel very confident in their roster right now. I'm sure it's not a Super Bowl roster, and I think that they know that themselves. But what they did do is they stabilized their offensive line when their best offensive lineman, one of the top left tackles in football, went down with an injury. And that was very important because it would have been so easy to just say, you know what, J.J. McCarthy is going to be back next year. This season really isn't going to be our season. The Detroit Lions are head and heels above every other team in the NFC. The Green Bay Packers are right on our heels in the NFC North. The Chicago Bears are free falling, so that's a good sign. Matt Eberflus is going to be fired. But really, let's just set our sights and our eyes and our hopes on the following season, and let's just get through this year. But they didn't do that. They found a rental player. They found a guy that you can get for cheap, that the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to help pay salary, and they brought him in. He started. He looked good. So this was a massive decision by the Minnesota Vikings organization because it allows flexibility on the offensive line. If Ed Ingram stinks, which he has for almost the entire season, well, then you bring in Dalton Risner, and you have that flexibility on the offensive line. So it was a big deal. And, they didn't trade for a cornerback or a defensive tackle. It doesn't mean that they can't do that this offseason. It doesn't mean that they can't take a first-round pick from 2025 or 2026 and send it over to the Giants or to the Panthers for one of these cornerbacks or for one of these defensive tackles. So let's just let it play out. I love that the Vikings didn't force something upon the organization this year, because when you make a trade like that, then you just add all this additional pressure to the head coach, to the quarterback, and to the entire roster. So I love that they stood pat. They like where they're at, and I like where they're at too. It doesn't seem like a free fall is going to happen. Like I mentioned that it could. They were certainly looking like it could after 2 straight losses to the Lions and the Rams, but they got back on track in the second half against the Colts. Now they have a game against the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Tennessee Titans, which are no guaranteed victories on the road. Jacksonville Jaguars, as bad as they are, they've been competitive in almost every single game this season. So it's something that I think is respectable for the Minnesota Vikings not to make any additional moves, because they made the big move that they needed to make to stay relevant and competitive in the NFC North and in the NFC. If they stood pat, didn't sign an offensive lineman or trade for an offensive lineman following the Christian Darrisaw injury, well, then we might be having a different conversation. But they reacted quickly, and they reacted very promising because they signed or traded for a solid left tackle that's a 1-year rental that they don't have to worry about re-signing next year. So it worked out great for the Minnesota Vikings, and I think that Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, the Minnesota Vikings organization, Kevin O'Connell, those decision makers deserve a lot of credit for bringing in a guy really quick and responding and getting him in the starting lineup and having a very successful day against the Indianapolis Colts, because there's a lot of teams that wouldn't make a move there. And there's a lot of teams that would just be, you know what, let's just flush this season. And they didn't. They brought in a guy that could add value to the Minnesota Vikings offensive line. So congrats to the Vikings organization for doing that. And congrats for them for not making a desperate trade for Dexter Lawrence or a J.C. Horn. Because as exciting as that would have been, I mean, I would have been hyped for it. I would have been excited for it. Are the Minnesota Vikings really ready for that? Do they really want Sam Darnold to have all of that weight on his shoulders to be like, okay, go win a Super Bowl now? It's all on you. So I like that they did what they did and stayed in the median. They didn't overreact. They didn't underreact. They stayed right in the median. They made the moves that they needed to make, but they didn't make a big flashy move yet. They don't have to yet. So that's it for this podcast. Thanks for watching.